Before we begin, I'd love your support. Subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you the untold stories of the famous that truly deserve to be remembered. The cameras weren't rolling, but I could feel every eye in that theater burning into my skin. March 27, 2022. The Dolby Theater. The Academy Awards. 60 seconds away from destroying everything I'd spent 30 years building. My hands were trembling, not from nerves about potentially winning. I was certain I'd win tonight. No, this tremor was something deeper, something that had been building for decades like a fault line under pressure. One wrong move, one moment of lost control, and the earthquake would level everything. But let me tell you how a kid from West Philadelphia ends up sitting in the front row of the Oscars, bow tie feeling like a noose, about to commit career suicide in front of a billion people. It started with a lie I told myself when I was 12 years old. I was walking home from school through a neighborhood in Winfield when I heard the gunshots point three sharp cracks that sent everyone scrambling for cover behind cars and into doorways. As I pressed me back against a brick wall, heart hammering against my ribs, I made a decision that would shape the next 40 years of my life. I would never, ever let anyone see me scared. When I got home that day, my mom, Caroline, was in the kitchen, her face etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen every month we stayed in that neighborhood. "You okay, baby?" she asked, scanning my face for signs of trauma. I flashed her my biggest smile. "Yeah, Mom, I'm good. Actually, something funny happened on the way home." And I launched into this elaborate story about a dog that got loose and was chasing its owner down the street, making her laugh until tears ran down her cheeks. That was the moment I discovered my superpower. I could take fear and transform it into joy. I could take pain and make it disappear with a smile and a joke. But what I didn't realize then was that superpowers always come with a price. The price was that I stopped feeling my own pain. I became so good at making everyone else feel better that I forgot how to sit with discomfort, how to process anger, how to be anything other than the guy who fixes everything with charm. When my dad would come home drunk and angry, I'd start performing, rapping, dancing, doing impressions until he was laughing instead of yelling. When my grades slipped because I was spending almy time perfecting my entertainment skills, I'd charm my teachers into giving me second chances. When my high school girlfriend broke up with me because she said I never let her see the real me, I just smiled and said, "What you see is what you get, baby." But she was wrong. What everyone saw was a carefully constructed performance, perfected over years of practice. The real me was buried so deep that sometimes I forgot he existed. Then came the music. DJ Jazzy Jeff and I started making these fun, clean rap songs that parents could tolerate and kids could love. When parents just don't understand, hit, suddenly we were the good guys in a genre full of controversy. We were safe. We were acceptable. We were the rap duo your mom would invite to dinner. The problem with being the safe choice is that you start to believe that's all you can be. Standing on stage at the 1989 Grammy Awards, holding that trophy for Best Rap Performance, I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt this weird emptiness like I was watching someone else's life. Because even as I was achieving my dreams, I was constantly calculating. Is this the right thing to say? Will this make people like me more or less? Am I being too black? Not black enough? Too street? Too suburban? The IRS troubles that followed were a wake-up call wrapped in a nightmare. $3 million in unpaid taxes. Suddenly, the golden boy of hip-hop was broke and under government investigation. But did I let anyone see me sweat? Hell no. I kept performing, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was under control, even as my world was collapsing. That's when NBC threw me a lifeline called The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Walking onto that soundstage for the first time, I was terrified. I had no formal acting training, no experience beyond music videos and a few bit parts. But I had something more valuable, the ability to hide my fear behind a perfect smile. Just be yourself, the director told me during rehearsals. If he only knew that I'd forgotten who that was. For 6 years, I perfected the art of being Will Smith. Charming, funny, relatable, but aspirational. The guy every parent wanted their son to be and every person wanted to hang out with. I memorized not just my lines, but everyone else's too, because control was the only thing that kept the anxiety at bay. James Avery, who played Uncle Phil, saw through it all. During our third season, we were shooting that episode where Will's father abandons him again. You know the one. After filming that final scene, I was still in character, tears streaming down my face in my dressing room. James knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "Will," he said in that gentle, authoritative voice, "you know you don't have to carry everyone's emotions along with your own, right?" I wiped my eyes and gave him that trademark grin. "I'm good, Uncle Phil." Just got caught up in the moment. He studied my face for a long moment. "Son, there's a difference between being strong and being afraid to be vulnerable. Don't confuse the two." I nodded like I understood, but inside I was thinking vulnerability is a luxury I can't afford. Because mine, the moment I stopped being perfect, the moment I stopped being what everyone needed me to be, was the moment they'd all walk away. When the show ended in 1996, I made a promise to myself. I was going to become the biggest movie star in the world. Not just successful, the biggest. I studied box office numbers like scripture, figured out the formula for global appeal. Big budget, summer release, action comedy hybrid, internationally accessible. Independence Day proved the formula worked. Men in Black cemented it. By the late 90s, I wasn't just an actor. I was a brand, a guarantee of entertainment value. Will Smith equals fun, family-friendly blockbuster entertainment. But with every success, the cage got smaller. The expectations grew heavier. I couldn't just be good anymore. I had to be perfect, likable, safe, the guy who never disappoints. And that pressure, that crushing weight of always having to be on, was building towards something I couldn't see coming. Something that would explode on a March night in 2022 in front of the entire world. After 20 years of blockbusters and near misses, when King Richard finally earned me that Oscar nomination, I thought I'd reached the mountaintop. I thought all those years of swallowing my anger, my frustration, my pain, I thought it had all been worth it. But as I sat in that front row seat at the Dolby Theater, bow tie cutting into my neck, something was stirring inside me. 40 years of buried emotions were rising to the surface, and I didn't have the tools to stop them. The cameras kept cutting to me throughout the show, and I kept smiling. I kept being Will Smith, charming, gracious, happy to be there. But behind that smile, behind those eyes that had charmed audiences for 3 decades, something was building. Something that was about to shatter the image I'd spent my entire life constructing. I just didn't know it yet. In my mind, this was going to be my night of vindication, my moment of triumph. Instead, it was going to be the night I discovered that even the Fresh Prince has a breaking point. And when that breaking point comes, when 4 decades of swallowed rage finally finds its voice, the explosion can be seen around the world. The thing about becoming a global brand is that you forget where the product ends and the person begins. By 2010, I wasn't just Will Smith anymore. I was Will Smith, complete with trademark smile, guaranteed box office appeal, and a public image so polished it could blind satellites. Every interview was choreographed, every red carpet appearance calculated, every social media post focus grouped in my head before I hit send. I had become a corporation masquerading as a human being. But corporations don't have nervous breakdowns. They don't lie awake at 3 a.m. wondering if their wife still loves them. They don't watch their children struggle under the weight of inherited expectations and feel their hearts shatter into 1,000 pieces. I did. The morning after the Hitch premiere in 2005, I woke up in our Malibu mansion and couldn't remember a last time I'd had a genuine conversation with my own wife. Jada was already up, sitting on our balcony with her coffee, staring out at the Pacific like she was searching for something in the waves. "Good morning, beautiful," I said, leaning down to kiss her forehead, automatically switching on the charm that had become my default setting. She looked up at me with those piercing eyes that had first captivated me 20 years earlier. "Will, when was the last time you told me something real? Something that wasn't calculated for maximum likability?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to respond with some clever deflection, but nothing came, because I couldn't remember either. I started, then stopped. For the first time in years, I had no script. "That's what I thought," she said quietly, turning back to the ocean. That should have been my wake-up call. Instead, I threw myself deeper into work, into the performance of being Will Smith. Because work was safe. Work had rules. Work had scripts and second takes and editors who could fix your mistakes. Real life didn't offer those luxuries. The pressure intensified when Jaden started showing interest in acting. My beautiful, brilliant son who could have been anything he wanted, and he chose to follow in my footsteps. The pride I felt was matched only by the terror that I was condemning him to the same prison of perfection that had trapped him. When he was 8, sitting in my trailer during the filming of The Pursuit of Happiness, he looked up at me with those wide, curious eyes and asked, "Dad, why do you always seem different when there are cameras around?" Out of the mouths of babes. "What do you mean, son?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "You get bigger, louder, like you're performing even when you're just talking to the crew." I knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that were too wise for his age. Sometimes, Jaden, being yourself isn't enough. Sometimes you have to be what people need you to be. The words tasted like ash in my mouth even as I said them, because I was teaching my son the same lie that had been slowly killing me for decades. Years later, when After Earth became one of the biggest disasters of my career, I watched that lesson destroy something precious in my boy. The film was supposed to be his star-making vehicle, his Independence Day moment. Instead, it became a public humiliation that we both had to endure with matching smiles. Sitting in the car after the premiere, neither of us speaking as we drove through the Hollywood Hills, I could see him staring out the window with the same expression Jada had worn that morning on the balcony, searching for something that felt real in a world of calculated performances. "I'm sorry, son," I whispered into the darkness. "For what?" he asked, though his voice told me he already knew. "For teaching you that being yourself isn't enough." The silence that followed was louder than any explosion in any action movie I'd ever made. But even as my family life was cracking under the pressure, the public demands never stopped. Every magazine cover had to be perfect. Every talk show appearance had to be electric. Every premiere had Toba's celebration, regardless of how I actually felt about the film. I remember standing in my walk-in closet, a room bigger than the apartment I'd grown up in, getting ready for the 7 pounds premiere and having what I can only describe as an out-of-body experience. I was watching myself select the perfect tuxedo, the perfect watch, the perfect smile to wear for the cameras. And for a moment, I genuinely couldn't tell if I was Will Smith preparing for a premiere or an actor preparing to play Will Smith. The distinction had become meaningless. Jada found me there, frozen in front of the mirror, bow tie hanging untied around my neck. "You okay, baby?" she asked, though the concern in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be tonight," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. She stepped behind me, her hands working the bow tie with practiced ease. In the mirror, I could see her studying my reflection like she was trying to recognize someone she once knew. "You're supposed to be my husband," she said softly. "Jaden and Willow's father. Willard Carroll Smith Jr. from West Philadelphia. Remember him?" But I couldn't. Somewhere between the Fresh Prince and the Fresh Prince of Hollywood, that kid from Philly had gotten lost. All that remained was this carefully constructed persona that everyone loved, but no one really knew. The tabloids began to sense the cracks. Every grocery store checkout line became a minefield off headlines. Will and Jada, marriage in crisis. Behind the perfect smile, Will Smith's secret pain. Is America's favorite family falling apart? The irony was devastating. The more perfect I tried to appear, the more obvious it became that perfection was impossible. The harder I smiled, the more people wondered what I was hiding behind that smile. And I was hiding everything. I was hiding the panic attacks that started hitting me before big premieres. I was hiding the nights I'd drive around Los Angeles for hours, windows down, music blasting, trying to remember what it felt like to be spontaneous. I was hiding the fact that sometimes, in the middle of interviews, I'd look at the host and think, if you knew who I really was, you'd never ask me another question. The lowest point came during the promotional tour for Hancock. I was sitting across from Oprah, the queen of authentic conversation, and she asked me what seemed like a simple question. Will, after all these years in the spotlight, what keeps you grounded? For 30 seconds, I said nothing. On national television, in front of millions of viewers, I just sat there, searching for an answer that felt true. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, then excruciating. Finally, I said, "You know what, Oprah? I'm still figuring that out." It wasn't the smooth, quotable sound bite they were expecting. It was just honest. And for a brief moment, I felt like myself again. But that moment of authenticity terrified me more than any stunt I'd ever performed. Because if I started being real, if I started letting people see the cracks in the facade, what would happen to Will Smith? What would happen to the brand I'd spent decades building? The answer scared me too much to find out. So I doubled down on the performance. I became more charming, more energetic, more relentlessly positive. I became everything everyone expected Will Smith to be, even as the man underneath was suffocating. By the time King Richard came along in 2021, I was desperate for redemption. This wasn't just another role. It was my chance to prove that I was more than just a movie star, that I was an artist, that 30 years of compromises and calculated choices had been building towards something meaningful. Playing Richard Williams, I found something I'd lost years earlier: purpose. Richard was a man who refused to let the world define his worth or his daughter's potential. He was uncompromising in his vision, unapologetic in his methods, and completely authentic in his love for his family. Everything I'd forgotten how to be. The performance felt like an exorcism. For the first time in decades, I wasn't playing a version of Will Smith. I was playing a character who demanded I dig deeper, reach further, risk more. When the cameras rolled, I could feel decades of buried emotions pouring out through Richard's words, his gestures, his unwavering belief in his children. When filming wrapped, I knew I'd created something special. But I also knew that the man who had created it, the real Will Smith, was still buried somewhere beneath layers of celebrity scar tissue. The Oscar nomination felt like vindication, but it also felt like pressure. This was my shot. My chance to finally be recognized not as a movie star, but as an actor. Not as a brand, but as an artist. As March 27th, 2022 approached, I could feel something building inside me. 40 years of swallowed words, suppressed emotions, and performed perfection were creating a pressure that my carefully constructed persona couldn't contain much longer. I just didn't know that the explosion, when it came, would happen in front of 1 billion people. Sitting in that front row at the Dolby Theater, adjusting my bow tie for the 100th time, I thought I was nervous about winning. I thought the tremor in my hands was anticipation. I was wrong. It was everything I'd been burying for 4 decades, finally demanding to be heard. And in just a few hours, the whole world would hear it. I hadn't slept in 3 days. Not really. Fragments of unconsciousness here and there, never more than 20 minutes at a stretch before my mind would jolt me awake with another scenario, another speech, another version of how this night might unfold. By the morning of March 27th, 2022, I was running on nothing but adrenaline and 40 years of muscle memory. Standing in our bedroom at 6 a.m., staring at the tuxedo hanging in our closet like it was a costume for a most important performance of my life, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me. My hands were shaking, not trembling, actually shaking, and for the first time in decades, I couldn't make them stop. "Baby, you need to eat something," Jada said from behind me, her voice carrying that careful tone she used when she was worried but try not to show it. I turned to look at her, this woman who had been my anchor for over 2 decades, and for a moment, I couldn't remember how to respond. The autopilot that usually kicked in during moments like this, the charming deflection, the easy joke, the reassuring smile, had gone offline. "I'm not hungry," I said, and even those 3 words felt foreign in my mouth. She studied my face with those penetrating eyes that had always seen through my performances. "When's the last time you ate? Really ate?" I tried to remember. Thursday? Friday? The days had become a blur of interviews, final preparations, and an increasingly desperate internal monologue that oscillated between absolute certainty that I would win and paralyzing terror that I would lose. "I'll eat after," I said, which we both knew was a lie. The red carpet was a nightmare disguised as a dream. 3 hours of standing in the California sun, wearing a smile that felt painted on with latex, answering the same questions over and over while photographers screamed my name from every direction. Will, over here. How does it feel? Are you ready? This is your year." Each flash felt like a small explosion against my retinas. Each question felt like a test I might fail. Each, "How does it feel to finally be recognized?" felt like a paper cut across an already raw wound. "It feels incredible," I heard myself saying to Entertainment Tonight, the words coming from some automated part of my brain while the real me watched from somewhere far away. I've been blessed to work with such an amazing team, and Richard Williams' story is one that needed to be told. Perfect answer. Media trained. Risk-free. Completely hollow. Jada stood beside me in a stunning emerald gown, her presence both comforting and complicated. We hadn't talked about the elephant in the room, her history with the Academy, her previous boycotts, the way she carried herself like she was attending the event but not participating in it. She was here for me, and knew that. But she was also here as herself, a woman who had been overlooked and undervalued by this same institution that was finally, maybe about to validate her husband. "Jada," a reporter called out, "what does tonight mean for you?" I felt her tense beside me, felt the careful calculation that preceded every public statement we made. "I'm proud of my husband," she said simply, but I caught the edge in her voice, the weight of everything she wasn't saying. Walking into the Dolby Theater felt like entering a cathedral dedicated to validation. The golden walls, their carpet flowing like a river of aspiration, the faces of past winners looking down from photographs like secular saints. This was the holy of holies for people like me, people who had spent their entire lives seeking approval from strangers. Our seats were in the front row, center section, prime real estate. The kind of placement that says this person is expected to win. Every time I looked around, I caught other nominees glancing in my direction, some with supportive smiles, others with the carefully neutral expressions of people managing their own disappointment in advance. The theater was filling up around us, a constellation of fame and ambition dressed in designer gowns and rented tuxedos. But all I could focus on was the weight of expectation pressing down on my chest like a physical force. Amy Schumer, Wanda Sykes, and Regina Hall took the stage to open the show, and immediately I knew it was going to be a long night. The jokes were sharp, the energy manic, and every laugh from the audience felt like fingernails on a chalkboard. Not because the humor was bad, it wasn't, but because I was wound so tight that any sound felt like an assault. "This year's show is going to be so much fun," Amy announced to thunderous applause. "We're going to keep things light and fun." Light and fun. The words echoed in my head like a mantra I couldn't quite believe. Everything felt heavy. Everything felt serious. Everything felt like it carried the weight of my entire career. The cameras kept cutting to me throughout the early segments, and each time I felt that familiar reflexive smile activate. Wave to the camera. Look relaxed. Look like you're having the time of your life. The performance was so automatic I could feel myself doing it while simultaneously watching myself do it, like an out-of-body experience orchestrated by decades of conditioning. But underneath the performance, something was unraveling. It started small. A tightness in my chest during the opening monologue. A hyper-awareness of every sound in the theater. The rustle of gowns, the clink of champagne glasses, the barely audible whispers of industry gossip being passed along the rows. My peripheral vision seemed to expand until I could sense every camera operator, every director making choices about when to cut to my reaction. By the time they started presenting the first awards, I realized I was holding my breath. Not metaphorically, literally holding my breath for 30, 40 seconds at a time until my lungs forced me to gasp quietly and start over. Jada noticed. Of course she noticed. She reached over and placed her hand on mine, and I could feel her surprise at how cold my skin was, how rigid my posture had become. "You okay?" she whispered during a commercial break. I nodded, because speaking felt impossible. Because if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure what would come out. The careful, media-trained responses? Or 40 years of accumulated frustration screaming into the refined air of the Dolby Theater? The show continued around us like a fever dream. Presenters came and went. Jokes were made. Awards were given. And with each passing moment, I could feel something inside me pulling tighter and tighter, like a violin string being tuned past its breaking point. When they announced that Will Packer was producing this year's ceremony, I felt a brief moment of relief. Will was a friend, someone who understood the business, someone who would keep things professional and respectful. But even that thought carried an undercurrent of anxiety. What if even Will's involvement wasn't enough to guarantee tonight would go smoothly? The supporting actor category came and went. Cinematography, costume design. Each award that wasn't mine felt like another step closer to the moment that would define everything. My category, Best Actor, was still hours away, but I could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. During another commercial break, I caught sight of Andrew Garfield a few rows behind us, looking relaxed and genuinely happy to be there. For a moment, I envied him so intensely it felt like physical pain. When was the last time I had attended an industry event just to enjoy it? When was the last time I had been anywhere without calculating every moment for maximum impact? The presenters kept coming to the stage. Some I knew well. Others were strangers whose names I recognized, but whose faces felt foreign under the bright lights. Each introduction, each joke, each moment of scripted spontaneity felt like another layer of performance built on top of performance. Then Chris Rock walked out. I'd known Chris for years. We'd run in the same circles, attended the same parties, shared the same stages. He was a brilliant comedian, someone who could find humor in the darkest corners of human experience. Under normal circumstances, I would have been excited to see him, curious about what Joe Kesh prepared for the biggest night in Hollywood. But these weren't normal circumstances. I was barely holding myself together, running on fumes and desperation, every nerve ending exposed and raw. As Chris began his routine, I found myself studying his face instead of listening to his words. There was something in his expression, a glint in his eyes that made my stomach clench with anticipation. Not the good kind of anticipation, the kind that comes when you sense a predator circling. The audience was laughing at something he'd said, but the sound felt distant, muffled, like it was coming from underwater. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused entirely on Chris's face, on his mouth moving, on whatever words were about to come out. And then I heard it. My wife's name. Jada's name coming out of his mouth in a way that made every muscle in my body go rigid. "Jada, I love you. G.I. Jane 2, can't wait to see it." The words hit me like a physical blow. The reference to her shaved head, to the alopecia she'd been struggling with for years, to the vulnerability she'd only recently found the courage to share with the world. The audience was laughing. Some of them were actually laughing. And I could feel Jada tense beside me, could see her rolling her eyes and trying to maintain her composure. But something inside me had snapped. Not broken, snapped. Like a rubber band stretched too far, too fast, with too much force. 40 years of being the good guy. 40 years of taking the joke, playing along, being what everyone needed me to be. 40 years of swallowing my anger, my hurt, my desperate need to protect the people I love from the casual cruelty that passed for entertainment in this town. All of it, every moment of suppressed rage and buried pain, came rushing to the surface at once. I was standing before I realized I had decided to stand, moving before I knew where I was going, walking toward the stage with a sense of purpose so clear and terrible that it felt like destiny. The audience was still laughing. The cameras were still rolling. The show was still going on around me, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. But I knew, even as I took those first steps, that nothing would ever be the same again. Time stopped, not metaphorically, literally. The universe held its breath as I stood up from my seat and began walking toward the stage. Each step felt like a decision I was making and had already made, like destiny and choice colliding in real time. The sound of my dress, shoes against the theater floor echoed in my head, louder than the orchestra, louder than the murmur of confused voices starting to ripple through the audience. 10 steps to the stage. 9. 8. Chris was still talking, still delivering his routine, but his voice sounded like it was coming from another dimension. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel with him at the center. Everything else blurred and irrelevant. The lights, the cameras, the faces of 3,000 industry colleagues. All of it faded to background noise. 7 steps. 6. 5. I could feel Jada behind me, could sense her shock without turning around, could feel the collective intake of breath from the front rows as people realized this wasn't part of the show. This wasn't scripted. Will Smith was walking onto the stage during Chris Rock's presentation, and nobody knew why. 4 steps. 3. 2. My right hand was already forming a fist. Not consciously, my body had made that decision without consulting my brain. 40 years of suppressed rage had taken control of my nervous system, and Will Smith, charming, safe, family-friendly Will Smith, was no longer driving. 1 step. I was on the stage now, in front of 3,000 people and a billion more watching around the world. The bright lights that had felt oppressive from my seat now felt like spotlights illuminating the most important moment of my life. Chris saw me coming. I watched his expression change from confusion to concern to the dawning realization that something was very, very wrong. He stopped mid-sentence, his microphone still in his hand, and for a split second, we were just two men from opposite sides of the entertainment industry, looking at each other across a chasm that was about to become unbridgeable. Oh, he said, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. That's when my hand connected with his face. The sound was louder than any applause I had ever earned, sharper than any laugh I had ever generated. A T cut through the air of the Dolby Theater like a gunshot, silencing 3,000 conversations in an instant. The impact traveled up my arm like electricity. His head snapped to the side. His body staggered backward. The microphone dropped from his hand and hit the stage floor with a metallic clang that seemed to echo for eternity. For one perfect, terrible moment, I felt free. 40 years of swallowed words, buried anger, and performed perfection, all of it released in a single, violent second. The mask didn't slip. It shattered. Completely. Irreversibly. In front of everyone who mattered and everyone who didn't. But that moment of freedom lasted exactly as long as it took for my hand to fall back to my side. Then came the silence. Not the comfortable silence of a theater waiting for the next line. Not the expectant silence of an audience anticipating a punchline. This was the silence of shock, of disbelief, of 3,000 people trying to process what they had just witnessed. I turned and walked back toward my seat, my legs moving on autopilot while my brain caught up with what my body had just done. Each step felt like walking through quicksand. The audience was a sea of open mouths and wide eyes, people literally leaning forward in their seats, trying to understand what had just happened. Chris straightened up, touching his cheek, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on another human being, a mixture of shock, hurt, and something that might have been pity. "Wow," he said into the silence, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it. Will Smith just smacked the shit out of me. Some people laughed. Nervous, uncertain laughter that died quickly when they realized this wasn't a bit. This wasn't comedy. This was career suicide happening in real time. I reached my seat and sat down heavily, my body moving independently of my mind. Jada was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Shock, certainly, but something else underneath. Something that might have been recognition, as if she was seeing a version of me that had been hiding for decades. But I wasn't done. The rage that had propelled me onto that stage was still burning, still demanding to be heard. All those years of being the nice guy, the safe choice, the man who never caused problems, it was all pouring out of me like blood from a severed artery. "Keep my wife's name out your fucking mouth," I shouted from my seat, my voice carrying across the silent theater with a raw power I didn't know I possessed. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. This wasn't the carefully modulated voice of Will Smith, the movie star. This wasn't the charming delivery of the Fresh Prince. This was something primal, something that had been clawing at the inside of my chest for 40 years, finally breaking free. Chris, still on stage, still holding his cheek, looked directly at me. Wow, dude, it was a G.I. Jane joke. Keep my wife's name out your fucking mouth. I screamed again, louder this time, the words tearing out of my throat like they were leaving pieces of me behind. The silence that followed was absolute. 3,000 people holding their breath. Cameramen frozen at their posts. Even the orchestra seemed to have stopped existing. In that silence, I could feel everything changing. Not just the trajectory of the evening, not just my relationship with Chris Rock or the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Everything. My career, my reputation. My legacy. The image I'd spent 3 decades carefully constructing was crumbling in real time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Chris, to his credit, tried to salvage the moment. That was the greatest night in the history of television, he said with a shaky laugh, attempting to transform the disaster into comedy. But there was no comedy in what had just happened. There was only the sound of a man's life imploding in front of a billion witnesses. I sat in my front row seat, surrounded by the most powerful people in entertainment, and felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The rage was already fading, leaving behind something far worse. Clarity, crystal clear, unforgiving clarity about what I had just done. I had defended my wife's honor, yes, but I had also destroyed myself in the process. The Academy Awards continued around me, as if the world hadn't just shifted on its axis. Presenters took the stage. Awards were given. The machine of Hollywood rolled on, but I was no longer part of it. I was sitting in my seat, physically present but spiritually ejected from the community I'd spent my entire adult life trying to join. Every few minutes, the cameras would cut to me, and I would summon that old, familiar smile. Wave at camera. Pretend everything was fine. But the smile felt like a death mask now, a grotesque parody of the charm that had once been my superpower. Around me, I could feel the energy of the room shifting. Whispered conversations, shocked glances, the unmistakable sensation of becoming the story instead of just attending it. In the space of 60 seconds, it had transformed from beloved nominee to cautionary tale. The worst part was the waiting, sitting there for the next 2 hours, knowing that my category was still coming, knowing that I was still expected to win, knowing that if I did win, I would have to walk back onto that same stage where I had just committed the most public self-destruction in Academy Awards history. But that was still hours away. For now, there was only the silence, the stares, and the growing realization that the man who had walked onto that stage was not the same man who had walked off it. That man, the real Will Smith, the one who had been buried under decades of performance, had finally shown himself to the world. And the world was horrified. 43 minutes later, they called my name. And the Oscar goes to Will Smith, King Richard. The applause was polite, restrained. The kind of clapping you give at a funeral when someone says something nice about the deceased. I stood up from my seat, the same seat where I had screamed profanities at Chris Rock, and began the longest walk of my life. Every step toward that stage felt like walking through quicksand. The same aisle I had stormed down Enridge now stretched before me like a path to my own execution. Faces in the audience turned toward me with expressions I had never seen before. Confusion, disappointment, pity. Some people weren't clapping at all. They were just staring like they were watching a car accident in slow motion. The Oscar felt heavier than I had imagined. Not the weight of gold and medal, but the weight of winning something I was no longer sure I deserved. As I stood at that podium, looking out at 3,000 people who had just watched me destroy myself on live television, I realized I had no idea what to say. For 40 years, I had never been without words. Never been without a smile, a joke, a perfectly crafted response to any situation. But standing there, holding the statue I had dreamed of winning since I was a scared kid memorizing lines on a sitcom set, I was completely, utterly lost. Richard Williams was a fierce defender of his family. I heard myself saying, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. The irony wasn't lost on me or anyone else in that room. I had just played a man who fought for his daughter's honor, and then I had fought for my wife's honor in the most public, destructive way possible. The words kept coming, but they felt like they were being spoken by someone else. Something about love making you do crazy things. Something about being called to protect the people you love. The speech I had rehearsed for months was gone, replaced by a desperate attempt to make sense of what I had just done. I want to apologize to the Academy. I want to apologize to all my fellow nominees, I said, and I could hear my voice cracking. But I couldn't bring myself to say Chris's name. Not yet. The wound was too fresh, the shame too raw. When I walked off that stage, Oscar in hand, I knew I was holding both my greatest triumph and my greatest failure in the same golden statue. Backstage was a nightmare wrapped in politeness. Academy officials approached me with the careful diplomacy of hostage negotiators. "Will, we need to talk. Will, there are some concerns. Will, this is a situation that needs to be addressed." I nodded and smiled and said all the right things, but inside I was screaming. The mask was trying to assemble itself, but the pieces no longer fit. Too much damage had been done. Too much truth had been revealed. My phone was already buzzing with messages I couldn't bring myself to read. My publicist, my agent, my manager, all the people whose job it was to manage the Will Smith brand, frantically trying to contain a disaster that couldn't be contained. The ride home was silent. Jada sat beside me in the back seat of our car, the Oscar resting between us like a conversation we weren't ready to have. The streets of Los Angeles blurred past the windows, but all I could see was Chris's face the moment my hand connected with his cheek. "You okay?" Jada asked quietly as we pulled into our driveway. I almost laughed. Okay. I had just won an Academy Award and committed career suicide in the same night. I had finally received the validation I had been chasing for 3 decades, and I had destroyed it 60 seconds later with my own hands. "I don't know," I said, and for the first time in decades, it was the complete truth. The days that followed were a masterclass in how quickly fame can transform into infamy. Social media erupted in ways I had never experienced. Hashtag Will Smith trended worldwide, but not for my performance in King Richard. Memes of a slap spread faster than any movie trailer I had ever released. Late-night comedians had material for weeks, but it was the serious reactions that cut the deepest. Fellow actors expressing their disappointment. Industry leaders calling for consequences. The Academy announcing they were launching a formal review that could result in my expulsion from the organization I had spent 30 years trying to impress. 3 days after the ceremony, I published a public apology. Another carefully crafted statement, workshopped by teams of publicists and crisis management specialists. But even as I wrote the words, "E was wrong," and "I am embarrassed," I knew they weren't enough. How do you apologize for 40 years off, accumulating pressure, finally exploding in the worst possible moment? The resignation from the Academy came 2 weeks later. I couldn't wait for them to kick me out. I had to maintain some small shred of dignity by leaving on my own terms. I betrayed the trust of the Academy. I wrote in my resignation letter. I deprived other nominees and winners of their opportunity to celebrate and be celebrated for their extraordinary work. Every word was true. Every word was devastatingly inadequate. The professional consequences came swiftly and brutally. Projects canceled. Meetings postponed indefinitely. Streaming platforms reassessing their relationships with me. The machine that had built Will Smith was now systematically dismantling him, and I was powerless to stop it. But the personal reckoning was far worse than the professional fallout. Sitting in my home office at 3 a.m., staring at the Oscar on my shelf, I finally allowed myself to confront the truth I had been running from for 4 decades. The boy from West Philadelphia who had promised himself he would never let anyone see him scared had become a man so terrified of his own emotions that he had buried them until they exploded. Every smile had been a lie. Every charming deflection had been a betrayal of my authentic self. Every perfectly calibrated public appearance had been another brick in the wall that separated Will Smith from Willard Carroll Smith Jr. The irony was suffocating. In the one moment when I had been completely, authentically myself, raw, angry, protective, human, I had destroyed everything the performed version of myself had built. I thought about James Avery's words from all those years ago. There's a difference between being strong and being afraid to be vulnerable. I had spent 30 years confusing the two, and the confusion had nearly cost me everything. The hate mail was brutal, but it wasn't nearly as devastating as the disappointed messages from fans who had grown up watching me. Mothers writing to say they could no longer show my movies to their children. Teachers explaining how they had to find new examples of positive role models. Kids saying they didn't understand why someone they had looked up to had done something so wrong. Each message was a mirror reflecting back the magnitude of what I had lost. Not just a career, not just a reputation, but the trust of millions of people who had believed in the version of me I had spent decades perfecting. But in the wreckage, something unexpected began to emerge. For the first time in my adult life, I was being forced to exist without the protective armor of charm and performance. Stripped of the ability to toad-flecked with humor or smooth things over with charisma, I had to sit with the uncomfortable reality off-woe I actually was. And who I discovered, was someone I barely knew. The real Will Smith, not the movie star, not the Fresh Prince, not the global brand, was angry, scared, desperately insecure, hungry for validation in ways that had shaped every decision I had made since I was 12 years old. He was flawed and human and capable of terrible mistakes. He was also, for the first time in decades, real. Months later, sitting in my therapist's office, I would try to explain what it felt like to live for 40 years behind a mask, so convincing that even I had forgotten it was a performance. It's like being an actor who gets so deep in a character that they forget their real name. I told her. Except the character was designed to be everything I thought other people wanted me to be, and it never bothered to figure out who I actually was underneath. The road back, if there even is a road back, is longer and more uncertain than any journey I've ever undertaken. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. Some moments are so public, so documented, so permanent that they become part of your legacy whether you want them to or not. I will always be the man who slapped Chris Rock at the Academy Awards. That moment, those 60 seconds of uncontrolled rage, will be mentioned in my obituary. It will be the first thing people think of when they hear my name. It will overshadow 4 decades of work, millions of laughs generated, countless charitable acts, and even my eventual attempts at atonement. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe the cost of performing perfection for 40 years is having your imperfection displayed for the entire world to see. Maybe the price of hiding your humanity is having it exposed in the most inhumane way possible. The 12-year-old boy who decided he would never let anyone see him scared grew up to become Amon, so afraid of being seen that he forgot how to see himself. The mask he created to protect that frightened child eventually became a prison that the adult couldn't escape. Until one night in March, when 40 years of accumulated pressure found its release in the worst possible way, at the worst possible time, in front of the worst possible audience. I defended my wife that night. I also destroyed myself. Both things can be true simultaneously, and both things are permanently part of who I am now. The boy from West Philadelphia finally showed himself to the world. Raw, unfiltered, undeniably real. I'm still not sure the world, or I, will ever forgive him. But for the first time in 40 years, I know who he is. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. That way, you'll always be with us discovering the secrets and untold sides of the most famous lives in history.